Good morning, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of the Black Swan Capitalist YouTube channel. I hope you're all doing well. Today, I'm honored to be joined by a very special guest, Lynette Zhang. Lynette, it's an absolute pleasure to have you here, and I appreciate you taking the time to be here with me today.
Anytime at all. It is truly my honor and my pleasure to be here.
Well, the last time we spoke was almost a year ago, and I mean, we have so much to talk about. There's just so much happening right now. And just to lay it out for the audience here, we're going to be talking in this conversation about all kinds of things, but mostly banking deregulation, the central banks continuing their agenda to shift towards gold. From what we're seeing and the research we're doing, it seems that the financial system isn't just struggling, it's actually undergoing a major reconstruction. So what is your take on this overall?
Well, it 100% is. And I mean, I started talking about the reset in 2009, because that's truthfully when the system died, was in 2007, 2008. And that's when I became a prepper. But where we are right now, it was a huge casino in 2008 that blew up with the derivatives markets, which are just these big leverage bets. There's more derivatives in the system and throughout the system than there were then. There's more leverage in the system than there was then. And now we are absolutely 100% in a risk-on environment, which means everything is getting more and more and more and more expensive, and the currency's value is going down, down, down even faster.
You know, the economy, it's broken, but it's being also deliberately transformed. And this is something like, you know, one that's very interesting about this administration. They're not here to like fix anything. I think they're here to really break it and kind of bring us into this controlled transition towards a new financial system. We talked about this before.
Well, you look at even, you know, and I've been traveling around the world. I was in Australia and in Canada and here in the US. What I'm seeing are all of these ads on gambling, right? They're on constantly gamble, 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 with this little disclaimer on the bottom. If you have a problem, you know, the reality is that it has become a huge casino, and so much of this trading is done in the dark pools. I mean, we just went 51.8% of all trades are now done in dark pools, which means nobody has any level of price discovery. Wall Street, you know, we were trained to think that if the stock market's doing well, that is a reflection of what's happening in the economy. And there was a time when that was more accurate. And so we believed that. And now today, does the stock market or the crypto market or any of these markets actually reflect what the general public and what the economy is actually doing, which is contracting? Yeah. Right. I was talking to somebody this morning, and they're not in this space at all, but they're paying attention, and they are definitely looking at gold and silver. And he was telling me that he's been out in the field in his area talking to a lot of people, and what he's hearing is more and more and more personal distress, financial distress, emotional distress, and all of that is really everything that I see happening. I mean, are there wars brewing? I mean,
right.
There is so much change. I agree with you. This administration is coming in, making a lot of drastic fundamental changes. And frankly, some that I agree with, some that I don't agree with. And I don't have to agree with everybody and with everything. However, when I look at understanding where we are in this currency's life cycle, I agree with you 100%. This administration is breaking it, and then they will rebuild it. That's focus correct. And my goal has to become part of that conversation so that when it is recreated, the public has more control, like we did when we were on a gold and silver standard. Because if you didn't like what they did, you'd take in the piece of paper and you'd pull out the gold, and that would create restrictions. We need to have that again. The promise was convertibility. Okay, you can carry around this bill. You can carry around this bill. This is a $20 gold certificate, but you can walk into any bank with this and pull out this. And, the Federal Reserve note was trading at the same time, right? At the same purchasing power value, so that people would think that these are all the same. And when they took the gold and silver, when they took the gold away from it, these two went away and that one remained. And people were like, okay, nothing has changed.
Yep. And it's also more convenient. That's how they sold the idea, I think, in the early days. Hey, this is more convenient. We're going to take your natural resources. We're going to give you something that is completely made up, thin air. And that's what central banks have essentially done. They have perfected and mastered the art of printing money out of nothing to devalue the currency and consolidate the wealth by making inflation higher, which is not a natural phenomenon. It's a direct result of printing, to where people are forced to sell their assets because they have to pay higher prices of goods and services. And they're buying all this because they can afford to, since they print the money out of thin air. And it's crazy. There's no such thing as trickle down economics.
No.
The money always stays at the 1% and 2%ers. By the time it gets back down to the rest of the population, it's not worth anything.
I love the Federal Reserve chart at the Fed purchasing power of the consumer dollar, right? Yeah. Because it's really, do I think it's 100% accurate? No, we still have 3 cents left out of the purchasing power. And somehow that hasn't changed over the last 3 postings, which is not true, because your cost of living has gone up over the last 3 postings. So, but essentially we are at the end. That's why I say, because you can see it, we are at the end of this great experiment. And really, Versan, to your earlier point, that was the unique experiment that they started in 1913, which was to control the rate and speed of inflation.
Yeah.
And they do that with interest rates. So because there's only one way to fight deflation, that's prices going down, whether it's real estate or houses and how they generate taxes, real estate, stocks, bonds. If those go down, that's deflationary. So they have to prop them up with this. That's the only tool that they have. So if they want to slow it down, they raise the rates. And if they want to speed it up, they drop the rates. And this is the problem that I see right now, is that inflation is stickier. Of course it is. All that money they printed is still in the system, right? Yeah. It isn't evaporated. So the inflation they're finding is stickier. But what are they wanting to do? They're wanting to drop the rates. And the Federal Reserve did drop the rates into an already easy money policy, which is something that they don't typically do.
Yeah. It's very interesting. And again, like we said just previously, how they're keeping the public distracted with the political narratives. And that was all tied into what the Biden administration did, and the cloud pivot strategy. You're familiar with this, how they collapsed the economy from within in order to keep you distracted, but at the same time to accomplish all these other things that they have to accomplish to push their agenda. So it's much bigger. And of course, that's a rabbit hole we don't have time to go into, but this is exactly why we're seeing, I think, a wave of banking deregulation. It gives really Wall Street the greater freedom to take risks. And that's what you were just talking about. At the same time, it's the central banks who are aggressively accumulating the gold while taking those risks. And, it's like, what's really happening behind the scenes? Who benefits from this? And the short answer is it's the same financial elite that always controlled the system. So deregulation isn't really about helping the economy. I think it's about giving them more room to gamble.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I couldn't have said it any better. That's exactly it. And there's so many things that are hidden like this. What we see in the derivative market is the little bitty tip of the iceberg. It's what's hidden underneath that is opaque and we can't see it, right? That's where the danger is, not if you can see something coming, then you can get out of the way. That's what I try and do with my patterns, is enable people to see what's coming so they can get prepared to not just survive it, which these transitions are not easy for most people, not easy at all. So get into a position to be as independent. And we were talking about that, and you've made a lot of changes in that regard. And what do you need to have a reasonable standard of living? You need security in food, water, and energy, barterability, wealth. You got to preserve your wealth, community, which is arguably at the very top of my list these days, and shelter. And let's go back a little bit further than that to 2020, right? When the cerveza disease went rampant and everybody was shut down, what happened to the groceries?
Yeah.
Right? What happened to your accessibility to the things that you needed? Those supply chains haven't been fixed. That's not an easy fix. And so if you go in, they pull product to the front of the shelf, but if you pull one of those pieces out, it's empty behind it. So you have to, and that's why community has become really so important, because I've been working on this since 2008 because I knew the system died. And so I shifted and became a farmer. And I mean, really, do I look like a farmer?
No.
But about doing, but knowing what happens during these monetary transitions, most of the population, and look around the world, you can see it happening in real time right now, that rise in kids and people going to bed hungry at night.
Yeah, it's tragic.
In such a wealthy world, that should not be happening, but it's happening more and more and more. People
and that's more proof that this is about control, really. And a lot of people don't want to accept that, because I think of the fear. When people are naturally fearful of something, they get very defensive about it. So if you try to talk to a lot of people, even in our own community, the XRP space, that they believe just Trump's going to fix everything, not acknowledging and at least recognizing the cost and the pain that's going to be associated with this transition. And that's what's going to tie us into our next subject. It's central banks that are preparing for the monetary reset, but at the same time, they're positioning themselves with hard assets like gold. So we do see a shift towards gold and blockchain-based settlements. So my question then is, you and I both know that central banks aren't buying gold for no reason. They're preparing for something massive. But at the same time, integrating those blockchain-based payment settlement systems, and of course, Ripple and XRP, we talked about this many times in the past, but how do you see this intersection between precious metals and blockchain? How are they playing a role in this transition? What do you see happening here, if you don't mind?
I don't mind that at all. I think that's a fabulous question. And it's an ownership. The blockchain is about securing, knowing where that comes from and the ownership. And it actually supports digital assets that can be traded on a global basis. And so I really see it moving into really a one world system is what they're going for, that ease of cross-border transactions. And the IMF is frankly perfectly positioned. They've been working on a universal currency, which to me makes the most sense because their SDR, their internal currency, is a basket of global currencies. So we can have a local currency, the dollar coin or the Canadian dollar coin, whatever it is, but then that's easily translated if the SDR does take over as the universal currency, it's easily translated into any other local currencies.
Right.
So again, if they just came out and said, okay, now the money is going to be this universal SDR, people would understand the shift, that there was a great shift, and they could possibly and probably rebel against it. But if they could keep the currency, it's just like what I showed you here, right? And so when you're looking at the digital, well, they've been taking us off hard assets really since I mean, it's a process, right? They can't do it overnight because then you understand the shift. But personal credit cards came out in the 50s, and it was about getting people used to not using this, right? So now when you look at what's going on and the adoption, and the way that they do that adoption is by letting things go up, because then that gets eyes and people are afraid of missing out. And what I see is this is the final adoption piece for enough people to participate, to make it easier to transition into those CBDCs.
That's correct.
I know that President Trump has said, no, we're not going to have CBDCs, but I don't think we know everything. And I don't think that there's any central bank or government agency that is really going to be transparent. But I do see blockchain enabling gold to come back into the monetary system and be used on a day-to-day basis in transactions, and also to create stability and limitations in what our government agencies can do. And I also see blockchain as giving the public the ability to do a direct vote on something. And so maybe we don't need all of these politicians out there that really are about whatever it is that they want. And it's not really about supporting the public good.
Right.
I can see that time. The thing that I'm going to say, though, and I really need to emphasize this more, if I could emphasize this completely, right?
Please.
Do not be fooled. You're going to hear so many things about the asset-backed securities, the asset-backed digital coins, whatever, the tokenization. It must be convertible. You must have the ability to pull it out if you want to.
Agreed.
Because that is the only way that you can hold these guys' toes to the fire. We just saw the Zimbabwe experiment, right? Oh, it's 40% backed. It's 40. We promise we won't print more money than what we have here, and blah, 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 blah. And a lot of that gold was, they don't say it this way, but in reality, confiscated from the miners that are required to sell them a certain percentage, like 20%, for the local currency that's plummeting. So that is a form of confiscation. We're seeing that around us constantly. It's covert, it's not overt, but open your eyes and see it. So I see blockchain enabling a gold backed currency that is a lot more stable than just, we can do this at will. Okay. We got to stop that.
I agree. Yeah. I mean, based on the research we've done, and we've spoken about this in the past, and that was falling into the Bank for International Settlements taxonomy of money, the money flower, as you described, saying that how they've already done the early adoption for this mechanism. And based on our research, and we've proven this over the years now, it seems that they are setting the stage for some sort of two-tier financial system where gold is certainly going to be positioned as the foundation of confidence for the central bank at the central bank level, while digital assets like XLM, for instance, XRP, that are being positioned for streamlined settlement and liquidity purposes, but then other digital currencies for the public, CBDC essentially. And it seems that Stellar would be at the front of this, which is why the United Nations endorsed this. And you know what their convenient slogan is? Banking the unbanked. And I have a joke with my insiders and my friends saying, they're going to bank the unbanked after the IMF bankrupts the whole world, right? So the public, they're not being told this outright. But when the dust settles, I think all this infrastructure is kind of already in place. And Martin Armstrong, he shared this with me off record, and I'm okay to share this. He said, Versan, the IMF already has their currency ready. He said that they're trying to drag this on as much as they can to consolidate more wealth. And I totally see that. And by consolidating the wealth at the same time, inflicting these economic hardships, it makes it challenging and more expensive to hold on to cash and hard assets, to where we're pushed into the system.
Right.
And that's really what's happening.
Right. And if you go back to 2008 and you see what happened just in the real estate market alone, and the people that were forced to restructure their mortgages into new mortgages, which really, I mean, who reads the book before you sign? If you want to buy the house and you need the money, you say, okay, whatever it is. But yeah, absolutely, to your point, they say that it's like, do you know that the US tax system is voluntary? Trying
Yes.
to paying your taxes, but they classify it as voluntary, which
Yeah.
I think is amazing. When I first found that out, I called my accountant. I said, okay, I'm not going to volunteer anymore. I don't want to volunteer. He goes, nah, you really don't have a choice. Then it's
I,
not
I like
voluntary.
that.
But they classify it, so I don't know whether they justify it or what have you. I'm not really sure. But to your point, yes, they force you to adopt the system. Now, if you're very independent, you're not going to have to adopt it. If you become your own central banker and
Yeah.
you hold enough of this, and really the strategy that we execute at Zhang Enterprises is layered, right? And I can see where a digital convertible, as long as I can get my gold out of it, then I can support that. If I can't convert it and pull it out, then all it is pegged. It is not backed. And as we saw in Zimbabwe, bam, 44% overnight devaluation, 5-6 months in?
Yeah. Yeah. Really scary. And, you know, if we're going to have digital money, and this is something Dr. Pippa talked about, the World Government Summit in 2022. She follows me on X, by the way. Pretty cool. That means she agrees with what I'm saying then, if she's following me. What she said was, if we're going to have digital money, we need a digital constitution of human rights, which makes sense because we're transacting digitally. We're doing business digitally. Everything is digital these days. So we have to have that foundation before even having the discussion of XRP even, or any other digital money, because that's not even there. And that's something I try to talk about on the show sometimes. But you know, it's just really crazy. I hope more people understand the importance of owning tangible and convertible assets. They have to have convertible assets. I think that's how we maintain our freedom and anonymity, because digital money takes that all away from us. It really does. Let's talk a little bit about the role of debt, maybe in this transition. Some of our listeners are new, and we are at all-time highs in consumer debt, corporate debt, sovereign debt, yet people are still encouraged to borrow. Why
Right.
do you why, if you could share with the audience, why does the system keep pushing more debt when it's clearly at the current model just unsustainable?
Because they have nothing else. The system is based on constantly compounding debt. And to your point, with the debt levels for governments, corporations, and individuals at all-time highs, this debt, it hasn't been, it's not sustainable. Well, it hasn't been sustainable in a long time. We are compounding interest. And as any individual knows, if you get where you're not paying all of the interest plus some of your principal, that excess interest goes into your principal, and now you're compounding interest. You never get out of debt, but you are more controlled in what you can do, right? So this debt and the encouragement to take on more debt is about creating more money in the system. But remember, we need a huge crisis in order for them to justify the transition and get you to comply with the rules that they want. We have to crash the system. Nothing grows to the sky, but when you're looking at the debt, you can actually see the transitions between, as time moves on, getting us more and more and more into trouble. Again, I love the Federal Reserve, the FRED, FRED, the Federal Reserve Education Department charts, because they go all the way back to the beginning. Most of them, not all of them, but they'll go back to the beginning. And I always say, if you just look at something a teeny weeny bit different, it's amazing what you see. And you can see whether you're looking at the interest rates that the Federal Reserve or the central banks control, and whether it's Japan or the US or anywhere else, they look awfully similar, which is a decline in the interest rates. First, we had a big peak as we were transitioning into the pure debt-based system. And then what do you see is a series of lower and lower highs until we got anchored at zero and even into those negative rate experiments, which, by the way, the central banks have said that's a choice. You don't really have to not do negative rates.
Mm-hmm.
But if they've inflated all of the principal, all of your purchasing power away, which they admit it's right there and it's going to zero, that's the true value of it. Well, what do they do then? They have to attack your principal. And they have to do this, as you said earlier, it's a consolidation, it's a transfer of wealth. And I'm saying that we have a choice. At this point, we still have a choice. And we need to make that sooner than later, because I can't sit here and tell you when it's going to become apparent to the rest of the world, but it will become apparent. And you better be in a proper position when that happens. And I'm very grateful that I have that. I'm very grateful that the cerveza disease happened. I'm sorry for all the pain and everything that it caused, but it opened my eyes to what my personal hole was in my planning, which was a place to go of safety.
And yeah, I think a lot of people did experience that and they had time to research. And it's funny, some people made it, they totally figured out what's really going on, and most did not. They got stuck in the digital realm, if you will. But just to add some flavor to what you said, the debt-based mechanism is very interesting. I think the primary mechanism of debt is control, because the more people take on debt, the more dependent they become on that very system that produces that debt. And if you think about it, a debt-ridden population is actually easier to manipulate because they're too busy trying to survive to see the bigger picture by borrowing more debt. And meanwhile, it's those very same institutions that are using that economic downturn to consolidate more power and extract wealth from the middle class. So, to what you said, and you taught me this a long time ago, you vote with your wallet. I learned so much from you, Lynette. It's incredible.
You too. And I mean, that's what a community does, right? I mean, I have been working on this really hard, really since 2002. But once the system died in 2008, that's when I really started on my journey with food and making my last stand and all of that. We don't have that time luxury anymore. And truthfully, there's still more that I want to do. But if tomorrow we woke up and we needed to get the Hades out of here, I can support 40 people at my bug out location with all sorts of different talents, right? Everybody brings in a community, everybody brings to the table the gifts that they have been given. So if you know how to do plumbing, that's a great skill. If you know how to lay irrigation, you're a farmer, whatever. I have the gold and silver. We can come together as community and support a lot of people.
Yeah.
Actually, the more people that develop the community, the more support there is. And that's why, yes, we do sell gold and silver at Zhang Enterprises, but what we're really focused on is building local communities so that you can have security in those 8 mantra areas, but also global community, because this is a global issue. And if we could get 3% of the population to convert their garbage government debt-based money into sound money, then I think that we can have a shot at having a seat at the table in the new system. And if I'm sitting at that seat, I'm going to say it must be convertible.
The only way to really beat, I think, the banks at their own game is getting into hard assets for sure. So you stop using those debt liabilities and they lose control just like that. But again, the system is so embedded and programmed into us to where we continuously have to work for this toilet paper, as Robert Kiyosaki would call it, just to pay our bills.
Yep.
It's crazy. So until I think business owners and other people start to see the bigger picture, like when I ran multiple shops before I started doing all of this, I would actually accept silver to repair something for some of my clients. I used to work on computers and stuff. So we would accept silver, and even, I'm not even kidding, gold, sometimes other assets from my friends who are bullion dealers. And they're like, you don't want cash? I'm like, no, give me like a few silver coins. I'll take care of it.
Right.
But I understood the value. And that's something I learned long before I got into crypto too, which was pretty cool. So I've always been accumulating hard assets as I've gradually preserved my wealth. At the same time, I've certainly made returns on all my gold too. But it's about preserving wealth, really. And of course, keeping the anonymity and control.
And it's also about being in the position to have wealth shift your way. Because really, the single most important function of an ounce of gold is to hold its purchasing power over time. Right? So that no matter when you use it, and that's part of the challenge that I have, when they came out with standard money, they said, okay, there are 4 functions that this money must perform, because lots and lots of things have been tried over the years, but it must be a tool of measure, a medium of exchange, a short-term store of value to make sure that you're properly paid, and a long-term store of value so that no matter when you use this money, you are still have always been, it's held its value. So you want to plan for retirement, you want to plan to educate your kids or your grandkids or what have you, that money as a long-term store of value. So when they brought this money in, and by the way, you just said, and when people have to work harder, they don't have the time to pay attention. Those weren't exactly your words. But if you read the documentation, when they were preparing this new system, this fiat money system back in the early 1900s, that's actually what they said. If people have to work more to sustain their typical standard of living, they don't have time to pay attention to what we're doing. And those aren't exactly the words, but that is basically what they said. So you're spot on with that, Versan. And that was always the plan. And I say, let's stop that. We need to take back. I mean, it used to be back then that the individual, the public was at the top, and then the state governments were there to support the individual's rights, and the federal government was there to support the states who also supported the individual's rights. And with, a lot of the changes that we're seeing, and President Trump just saying, we're going to just stop these programs when the states generate about 30% of their income from those federal grant programs. What does that do to the state's ability to support the individual, the firefighters? And, look at the job that they're doing in California right now, but the firefighters, the police, the schools, everything, right? That gives them less money to work with. What are they going to have to do? They're going to have to raise property taxes.
I mean, that's something we did not talk about, which I would love to do another conversation on this, because, I mean, people have no idea about the layoffs that are just getting started. Not to mention a banking crisis of the regional banks. That's also going to jump right into the consolidation phase. It's so strange. They're always waiting to see, is the central bank going to raise, or are they going to cut, or are they going to pause? But as we both know, the real game is much bigger than just interest rates.
At least in the short term appearance, the US economy is doing really well, which again, if you're fighting deflation, you want to drop interest rates down to create more inflation. And if you're fighting inflation, you want to raise, and this is just theory because it ain't working now because we're at the end of the system, but you want to raise interest rates to create that deflation. And so what the Federal Reserve did, and then ultimately all of the central banks, was they broke a 40-year pattern, Remember, lower and lower interest rates so that you could afford more and more and more and more debt. But once you go negative, they can't do that on the current system because this debt instrument, which is what it is, it's a Federal Reserve note. A note is a debt instrument. At this point, is not always going to be true. But at this point, it neither pays or it charges you interest through the inflation of it, but it doesn't pay you any interest. And so what the central banks are talking about is embedding a chip in the new bills so that once they have everything digital, then what, these are their words, not mine. And I will quote this one. There are no limitations on how low we can push interest rates, which means attack your principal. Because the whole world is becoming or has become a consumer-driven economy. So that's why the consumers have to take on more debt because they have to keep shopping.
Yeah. I mean, that's something George Carlin used to say. What America's last value? Buying things. It's like buying things people don't need with money they don't have so they can spend the rest of their life paying interest.
Exactly. And there's just a small group of people that get to charge that interest and everybody else has to pay it. It's a great game. Because to your earlier point, what do they do with not just that money, but all the borrowed money is, and what you deposit in their accounts, whether it's a brokerage account or a savings or checking account, what have you. Once you make that deposit, you're loaning them that money. That gives them the leverage. And again, we used to think, if you think about the movie It's a Wonderful Life, well, your money is in her house and his house, and that's the way it works. And so that's the way we think about banking. But good God, 1929 and 1933, they separated the risk-taking banks from the deposit-taking banks. But then, what was it, 2005, 2008 was really the big push because there was consolidation. Now they've merged them. And banks make most of their money on trading. They don't make most of their money on those deposits, but it is the cheap source of funding for them.
Right. I mean, that's what they do. They take your dollars in, you make a deposit, they go loan it to somebody who wants a Mercedes that can't afford to pay that. They lose their job, they default on their payments, the bank confiscates it. Both.
Yeah, but it's also they takes those deposits and they buy those derivative bets with those deposits. Highly leveraged.
Yeah,
The comptroller of the currency does a report on a quarterly basis. Anybody has access to it. I don't have access to anything you don't have access to. But on derivatives, those big bets in the banking system, and they're higher. And remember, they're also reported in nominal terms because nobody, and admittedly so, whether it's the IMF or the BIZ or the FDIC or the Federal Reserve or any central bank, they admittedly have no idea of the true value that is at risk. So all they're really reporting is what the market value is that the banks claim. Good, because I trust them. So take a look at that chart. I mean, it's in there, and they were supposed to get rid of that risk taking. Well, it's higher than it was, and that's admitted. That's what they're admitting. There's so much stuff that's done off balance sheets. You can't see this stuff coming. You can't see the train coming because it is black and it is smoky at the same time. So that's why it's critically important to be prepared at a moment's notice.
Yeah. And when people ask me about, like, what do I think about the Federal Reserve and what they're going to do, I tell my clients this. The Fed's job is actually to keep people reacting, not thinking. Because whether they raise rates, they pause, or pivot, the goal is really to maintain control of the narrative. And if they raise rates, they push the economy closer to collapse. If they cut rates, they devalue the dollar. So either way, they still win. And the average person loses because they're playing the same game by the rules designed to keep them in check.
Spot on. Absolutely spot on. And their job is to lie. And I'm
Yeah.
sorry, but that's a politician's job too. They've got
Yeah.
to
Agreed.
lie some more. You know, I don't know. It would be amazing to see somebody with integrity at the top.
Yeah, and some people, I want to be realistic about things. I don't like to sugarcoat, but there are people that keep preaching that, oh, Ron Paul's for the people, Ron Paul's for the people. Now, I've heard him say some very wise things over the years, right? But when he said that the central banks were going to collapse, or we should shut down the Federal Reserve and the central banks, well, this is the interesting thing. If you look closer enough, the central banks were always designed to collapse at a
Mhm.
time of their choosing. What do I mean by this is when they've consolidated enough control and wealth, that's when they were designed to collapse. The problem will become bigger than the central banks can handle, which creates the necessity to accelerate the bridge into the new system.
Yep.
So that's the reality of the situation. So when you talk about politicians, I don't believe any of them. You have to be corrupt to be in office. I really believe that. And that's
Right.
a whole different rabbit hole, both sides of the same coin, but
Like,
we'll leave that alone.
I'm going to tell you this because I'm sitting here being amazed by it, and you know, I'm very guided, and so never in my wildest dreams, because I don't get political, right? I just stay economic because that's just a smokescreen, a distraction from what the banks are really doing. So that's really where I pay most of my attention. But I have come to realize in developing this community and really working hard to get sound money back in the system again, that it also has to be a grassroots effort. Because when I saw President Biden at the time, Mr. Biden, give a different status to marijuana, right? What that told me, why did he do that? He did that from the pressure from the states. Enough states were participating in it that the federal government really had no choice but to finally change policy. And I think we can do that with gold and silver too. So I've joined the Sound Money Movement Advisory Board, and we are working on and there's another one as well with JP Cortez, but we are working on getting legislation passed on the state level. So I guess you could say, and you see, this is hard for me to say, but
No, please
it's
continue.
not that I'm going to become a politician. I'll never do. I shouldn't say that. I'll do whatever I'm supposed to do. But yeah, we've got to get a little political. We've all got to look in the mirror and say, if not me, who? And if not now, when? And it isn't for me. I mean, I'd be fine the rest of my life with what I've been fortunate enough to be able to put together. However, I look at my grandchildren and I think about their children and their children after them. So this is the fight, and we have to pick up this baton and we have to say, no, we're taking control back. You can't do this. You can't take away our rights. I have more rights right now than my almost 10-year-old granddaughter. That to me is disgusting.
It's scary too. It
It's
makes you,
scary.
think. I have a lot of clients that book sessions with us, and they're so worried about their future. And I try my best to give them the utmost knowledge about how to mitigate whatever is coming this train. And it really ties us into some of the final parts of this discussion, and that's the future of the US dollar. I think, well, there's so much that goes into this because there are some people that still believe the US dollar is going to remain the dominant currency indefinitely. But I think from what we're seeing, and it's not being completely disclosed, they're not telling people about it. They're demonizing their opponents to keep people distracted again, political narratives. We see de-dollarization.
Mhm.
The BRICS nations, what they're doing, they're still continuing their path towards an alternate system, which will tie us into, again, blockchain and another discussion for that. But it's very clear that the dollar's role is changing.
Mhm.
So what is your take on this? And I know we kind of talked about a lot of everything that ties us into the dollar. So
Well, the dollar's role in the world has been changing actually for quite some time. I would say probably back to at least 2000 and earlier, because it was in 2000 that the Federal Reserve actually started buying government bonds, which means that the world was not prepared to absorb them. Further, since 2000, remember, the system died in 2008. And I could be off on this a teeny bit, but I'll be pretty close. I think it was 2012 was when we started to see a run on the dollar via the treasuries being held by Japan and China. And that has escalated. So the shift away from the dollar as the world reserve currency into that universal currency over at the IMF. I mean, that's the plan. And the IMF has said that they want to track all of the wealth. So we have to be really careful about putting all of our wealth on the blockchain system. You know, some of it, okay, it makes sense, cross-border, blah, 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 blah. I can see some of it, but not all of it.
Yeah.
If you don't hold it, you don't own it. And if they have everything in the system and they decide to shut you down for whatever reason, they don't like your political views, they don't like the way you do your hair, whatever it could be, right? What are you going to do? I mean, Canada tested that.
And they succeeded.
The legal, trucker strike, absolutely legal. And boom, you're out of the system. And anybody that supported you, boom, they were cut out of the system. And that's Canada, for goodness sakes.
Yeah, an aggregate of the United States, which is very close to us. So it could happen here too. It almost did happen, actually. What's very interesting is that I think as an investor, smart investors, they know how to cover all the angles, right? You want to make sure that every corner is protected in some way, form, or fashion. So if the banks go down, you have some cash. Exactly. If cash is completely devalued, you have gold. If gold is not accepted and cash is not accepted, you have food, water, weapons, ammunition to protect yourself. If none of that works, you have some skin in the game for crypto. So you have to protect yourself in all these avenues. And this is really what we teach here at Black Swan Capitalists. And the reason we called ourselves Black Swan Capitalists, we believe the next Black Swan event, of course, is the financial system. So let's be realistic about what we talked about regarding the dollar. Just to clarify for the audience, I don't want to see negative comments in there that the dollar is not going anywhere. So the dollar is not disappearing.
Right?
It's, it happens, but I understand. I don't really worry myself with it. It's just the dollar isn't disappearing. It's just losing its global dominance. So the transition is becoming gradually clear that the dollar is losing the dominance, but they don't want people to panic. So it's being phased out very gradually as the world's primary reserve currency and being, of course, repositioned just as another regional currency, in my opinion. And we're going to see this over time. But I think, meanwhile, it's the new financial rails that are being put into place. Of course, I'm going to mention this, the XRP and gold-backed settlements, I think, are being positioned to take on the greater role of a global trade. Having that bridge currency, right? And just, again, the dollar becoming a regional currency. So what do you think about that?
No, I think you're spot on with that. Personally, I'm not, I haven't gone into cryptocurrencies for two key reasons. Number one, they haven't been tested yet. They will be, but they haven't really been tested yet. So I know that this is something that lies in my future, but I want to see them pass the test. And because I'm holding my purchasing power in this, then whoever survives it, I will know and do that conversion. So I'm not as diversified in that way because I look at it like a Trojan horse. Yes. But it makes sense to be diversified for most people. I just have very high conviction because I'm the only one that I know that understands currency life cycles and how that wealth moves. And so my main goal is to be as independent and self-sufficient as possible, to be my own central banker, but to develop a network of community all around the world that can take that power back. Because if you go back to that purchasing power chart from the Fed and you look on the bottom of that left index, you can see a big fat zero. So they may call it the same. I mean, this was minted in 1903. And what does it say? $20, right? This is a $20 gold certificate. This is a $20 Federal Reserve note. So is the dollar going away? No, I don't think the name will go away, because then people would know that things had changed. And that's what they don't want you to know until they can kind of ease you into it. So I can see us having a dollar coin. So people think, oh, the US dollar never going away. Take a look at the purchasing power chart, please. Please, people, do yourself a favor. Take a look at that chart. This is not me saying it. This is the Federal Reserve showing you the true value of not just the dollar, but every single government debt-based currency. It is a big fat goose egg.
Yeah.
So my intention is to convert once I see what is happening, but I am more about the long-term strategy. I am super clear on where we are in this trend cycle. I've been doing this on some level my entire life, as you pointed out earlier. And I'm old. I'm 70. I don't feel old, but
no, you're not old.
I don't know. But I've lived a lot. I've lived through monetary transitions in the 70s. And actually starting in the 60s, when President Johnson took the silver out of the coinage and said, if you try and hoard it, we're going to control that market. We'll crash the market on you. A sitting president openly admitting to manipulating the is incredible.
Unconstitutional too. Yeah, and that's another reason why I also might as well share this. I purchase all my gold with cash, and I purchase my assets with cash. So I have that anonymity. I have a relationship with all the bullion dealers. They watch the show, by the way. And they have a deal with me where I pay them cash and both keep it off the books. So there's no digital trace of ownership, which means I can hide it. Maybe I shouldn't have said that online, but
get that on air.
Yeah. Now they're like, oh, well, now we know. Well, they'll never find it. So just final thoughts for this discussion. By the way, this has been such an insightful and great discussion. To the audience, I want to clarify, this isn't about fear. We're not fear mongering here. It's about really being realistic and seeing the bigger picture, because I think the institutions, and everyone knows this, the ones running the show, they're not clueless. They're executing a very carefully crafted transition that ensures that they maintain control. And the question then becomes, are you positioned correctly? Lynette, as always, I do appreciate your insights, and I know my audience does too, but do you have any final thoughts you'd like to share with everyone?
Yes. I always go about things. What if I'm right? And what if I'm wrong? And when I can do something so it doesn't matter if I'm right or wrong, that is my highest level of comfort, right? And so, but a lot of people procrastinate, and it's hard these days. Everything costs a lot more. So I want everybody to realize that gold and silver in any form is monetary at its base, but don't wait. I don't care what happens to the spot contract prices. Those are inaccurate. You are getting absolutely zero good price discovery from Wall Street. Period. End of discussion, because they can create as much gold and silver that does not nor ever will exist. But in this stuff, there is a finite amount. So focus and do it now. If you don't have time, go to your community garden and sign up to get a plot. If you can't get a plot, volunteer with somebody that has a plot or a bunch of people that have a plot, so that you create that community relationship. Go to your local farmer's market. Get to meet the people that grow your food, but develop that community. I mean, my neighbors don't really know what it is that I do, but they do know that they can come and pick a zucchini. They do know that if they have a problem, we just adopted a duck not that long ago, and
Oh, that's cute.
chickens, we rescued some chickens, which we're getting them healthy, and then we'll donate them to different people or organizations in the population to create food, right? To create some food security. But, make a positive difference for a lot of people, because while one person really, I mean, what can I do? I'm just one person. But together in community, now we have power. Now we have power.
So true. Well, Lynette, it's been an absolute pleasure talking to you. Always an insightful discussion. And I really can't wait to make it out to Arizona one day to check out your garden. I told you a long time ago.
Or when you go to Vegas.
Well, I'll consider it for sure. I mean, I really love botany. It's one of my truest passions when I'm not out here trying to survive. Just a huge thank you for everything you do.
It is my pleasure. It's why I was put on this planet. So I'm just showing up and doing the work. That's the only guarantee that I can ever give anybody. But I've been very blessed to have been doing this on some level my whole life, so that I can see what's happening and share that knowledge.